Hey everybody, and thanks for tuning in to this virtual presentation. My name is Michael Bossetta, and I'm Assistant Professor in Communication and Media at Lund University, and this work is co-authored with Jennifer Stromer-Galley and Jeff Hemsley at Syracuse. And what we're trying to get at in this research is try to find out to what extent do politicians post the same messages across social media platforms, and when and why do they post particular messages to one platform versus another. So researchers increasingly argue that politicians differentiate their messages across social media platforms. Notably, Kreis et al. Identify 5 factors that drive this differentiation based on their interviews with campaign strategists in the United States. They looked at candidate image, so controlling the candidate image was seen as one way that politicians differentiate their messages based on the audiences of each platform. Looking also at the action possibilities enabled by those platforms, so their affordances, the norms of communication that take place on particular platforms, and also the timing of those messages within the overall electoral cycle. But few studies have actually used data from platforms to corroborate these campaigners' claims. So I've looked at this a bit in the 2016 US election, seeing what the leading politicians were posting on Facebook versus Instagram. And what this basically shows is that for 3 of the 5 campaigns, over half of the content they posted on Instagram was also present on Facebook. So while we can expect that politicians would post differently across social media platforms, it's not always the case. So probably the leading study in this area that makes this argument that politicians post different messages across platforms is Steyer et al., who looked at the German context. And so they argue that politicians post different messages to different platforms, but you can kind of read their data either way. If you look, the boxes that are more dark blue are similarity, and lighter shades of blue are difference. And you can see there's quite a bit of similarity across different topics for what politicians post on Twitter versus Facebook. And they argue that there's a sort of difference on the one hand because of this relatively small statistical effect they find between the language use and their topic corpora. And secondly, and I think more interestingly, when they look at policy topics, so issues that the candidates are promoting, we see almost no difference between what was posted on Facebook versus Twitter. But where there is difference is in terms of promoting campaign events and discussions around political debates. And what I think this shows that there's a difference between promoting policy issues and promoting message functions that actually tend to have some effect on voters for the campaign. I'll get more into that as we move along. But so what we try to do is think, what are the 3 key elements that a cross-platform analysis needs? And obviously that's the quantity, how much was posted on one platform versus another. The content of those messages, does it differ across platforms? And then crucially, the function of those messages. What are those messages actually intended to do for the campaign? And do different platforms have different incentives to post, for example, mobilizing messages on one versus attack ads on another? So the research questions, which are very ambitious for the case we look at, but nevertheless, to what extent do political campaigns differentiate their messages across social media platforms? And secondly, what explains the similarity or difference in political campaigning across social media platforms? So what we're trying to do in this study is basically develop a scalable methodology for analyzing cross-platform versus platform-specific messages. And so to do that, we're using a very small data set in a way to check our computational methods as we go along. So we're focusing on the 2016 US general election, so the 10 weeks before Election Day, and we look at the Facebook and Twitter posts by Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump on their official campaign pages. And so what we decided to do is remove any content that didn't come directly from the campaign, so the language of the candidate, more likely the campaign. So we removed Twitter retweets, we removed Facebook shares that did not include input from the campaign, and we ended up with this number of posts, which again we acknowledge is quite small. But to look at the quantity of cross-platform differentiation, again, as a way to think about what can be scaled, we use fuzzy string matching in R, and particularly the Jaro-Winkler distance, which is a score developed by researchers at the US Census Bureau to match strings that may be different across different documents because of typos, which is, I think, kind of interesting. Here's the algorithm. I don't understand exactly how it works, but we wanted to test its performance. What we found is that by comparing Twitter and Facebook posts, when the Yarrow-Winkler distance was 0.2 or less, it tended to be a perfect match, but there were a lot of false negatives in there as well. So we went through and manually coded what was cross-platform and what was Twitter-specific and Facebook-specific, and here are the results. So this is raw numbers of posts per platform per day, and in yellow there, you'll see the percentage of cross-platform posts. And what we find is that over 60% of Clinton's Facebook posts were also on Twitter, and between 20 and 25% of Trump's were, depending on which platform you look at. And when you look at this in relative terms per day, it becomes a bit more clear as to how much cross-platform content there was. I think this is more than most people would expect, which is quite interesting. So we're also interested to see, what explains cross-posting. Can we find that posts that perform higher on one platform, do they get a lot of likes on Twitter and they're then posted on Facebook? We didn't seem to find that pattern really anywhere in the data set, but we did want to look at time differences between the cross posts. So we basically just took the difference between the timestamps in hours. And so the unit that you'll see on the y-axis is hours, and if the value is negative, that means it was posted to Twitter first. And when we take outliers out, we find that for the most part, the cross posts are posted within 1 hour of each other, often within 15 minutes of each other. But overall, it's very clear that candidates will post their cross posts to Twitter first. We also looked at content. This is a very basic top words analysis, and it's not really that interesting because we don't really see a difference when we look at the top 15 words for Facebook-specific, Twitter-specific, and cross-platform. But when we look at unique words per category, we do get some interesting signals. So when we look at Clinton for Facebook, we see that there's a lot of Spanish words that pop up, and it turns out that the campaign only messaged Hispanic audiences on Facebook, and we kind of checked that with the Pew Research data, and it turns out that there weren't a lot of Hispanics on Twitter in the 2016 or 2016 overall. So that kind of makes sense. We find for both candidates they had some media promotion hashtags and words on Twitter. What's interesting is that for cross-platform, we really don't see, just in the frequency of words being unique to that platform, being unique to both platforms. There was really not much that was cross-posted that was also not on Facebook or Twitter. So getting to where we're really going to take this project in the future, because we're still working on it, is looking at this difference between policy or issue topics versus strategic function. So we know that candidates can use social media for communicating policy. They tend to not do this. Most studies show a very low amount of policy communication during election campaigning, but during a campaign, there's a number of strategic functions that these messages can fulfill, right? They can be used to persuade, to mobilize voters, or to spread campaign information such as events and live streams when it's not during a pandemic. Or they can take it on, virtual town halls or what have you. So we used machine learning to classify topics, and we have a small data set. But again, we're trying to build something that scales, and our categories, varied between 60 and 70%. So we're actually in the process, just finishing up rather, hand coding these. So take these numbers with a bit of a grain of salt, but we divided them into, economic, immigration, foreign policy, things like that, and basically looked at what was cross-platform, what was Facebook specific and Twitter specific, and simple chi-square tests showed that the platform differences are not significant for Clinton when it comes to topics, but they are for Trump. And when we look at message strategies, these are our functional categories, and I'll go through these because these are important. Ceremonial is things that aim to build community, like thanking supporters or commemorating events like 9/11 or World War II. Attack is pretty self-explanatory, attacking the opponent. Advocacy was promoting causes that the candidate endorsed. Campaign information was promoting events and rallies. calls for action, which we've now broken down into online versus offline. This was anything that included a mobilization, call to action. Image was a broad category that dealt with image promotion of the candidate, and issues is kind of a lump category that is dealt with all of the policy tags that we had before. So this is kind of the sum of all things that are relating to policy. For both candidates, we find that chi-square tests show that there were significant differences between the cross-platform, Facebook-specific, and Twitter-specific categories. So then what we did is we decided to treat our issue and function tags as independent variables trying to explain platform location. And I know it's a bit messy, but I'll break it down. So first, we have a dummy variable, whether a message was cross-platform or not. So positive coefficients mean that each of these issue topics was more likely to be cross-platform, and negative coefficients signal that it was more likely to be specific to one platform. And what we find for both campaigns is that economic issues were negatively associated with being cross-platform, and that's really the only thing that pops up as significant, except for Donald Trump being more likely to promote military-type issues on both platforms. And then we removed the cross-platform posts from the analysis and focused only on Facebook and Twitter. So positive coefficients signal that this topic was more likely to be on Facebook, and the converse for Twitter. And what we see is that for the Clinton campaign, economic messages were more likely to be on Twitter, which kind of makes sense. And that's it, which is interesting. I'll return to this when we go to the function tags, but not much difference here in terms of policy issues across the platforms. When we look at the function tags, these sort of strategic categories, what we have is that for both campaigns, issues were negatively associated with being cross-platform, which is interesting because it's one of the few times that both campaigns show the same pattern. We see that Clinton was more likely to promote calls for action across both platforms. So I guess this means that they were trying to reach the largest audience possible for their mobilization initiatives, and we can really explain this by a last-minute mobilization push by the campaign is what's really driving this result. Campaign information for Trump was negatively associated with being cross-platform. But when we get to the differences between Facebook and Twitter, we see difference along issues, where for Clinton, issues are more likely to be talked about on Twitter, whereas on Trump, we see the reverse for Facebook. And we can really explain this by the fact that the Trump campaign on Facebook posted a lot of transcripts from speeches that Trump gave, and that included a lot of mentions of issues that are machine learning algorithms picked up. We have Trump being more likely to attack on Twitter, which makes sense, and campaign information was associated with, I can't read from this distance, unfortunately, on Twitter for both candidates. And what that signals is probably that because of the lack of algorithmic filtering on Twitter, they could reach supporters about upcoming media appearances at that exact moment. And we find some other small differences here, but I think the key takeaway point is that compared to the issue topics, we see that there is more differentiation by platform based on the function that those messages are intended to have for the campaign. So the results overall, I think, show that candidates engage in relatively high levels of cross-platform posting, more than we might initially expect. For example, 60% of Clinton's Facebook posts were also on Twitter. And it doesn't seem that this is driven by some sort of, watching the performance of a post on one platform and then recycling it to another, but it probably has to do more with resource constraints, that campaigns are under, tight time limits and resource limits. And so when they put out a message across both platforms, they tend to just broadcast it out to the widest audience possible within the same 15-minute range. But we do see that when that happens, campaigns prefer to post first to Twitter. We also see that platform audiences matter, that Clinton messaged Hispanics only on Facebook, and both candidates promoted mainstream media appearances on Twitter. Again, this might have to do with the fact that if you're trying to promote, going on a show in 10 minutes, it's better to do that on Twitter because you don't know how it's going to perform on Facebook. But also the user demography on Twitter is more interested in news and more likely to tune in to that interview. And finally, when we see differences in messaging across platforms, it appears to be driven by the function of that message, not so much policy issues. And we see low policy discussion on both Facebook and Twitter. That follows existing research. But we did see that coding messages by their function yield stronger indicators of difference. And so where we're taking this paper in the future is that, again, we are hand labeling rather than using machine learning to sort of see if the results are that different, which might lead to the machine learning approach being able to scale. And we're also going to hold out until the end of this year's election in order to compare the Biden and Trump campaigns to see if these results hold over time. So that's it. Thanks so much for watching, and feel free to get in touch if you have any questions. Thanks.